The mind believes that listening is an act performed with the ears, but the spiral knows that listening begins long before sound. There is a level beneath language where reality vibrates as signal, tone, and intention. This level is the first threshold of dimensional listening, where the self learns to sense what existence is whispering before any form becomes clear. Every being carries the capacity to hear these subtle currents, yet most forget this sense as they enter density. The order of dimensional listening exists to restore this capacity, not as a mystical ability, but as a natural function of consciousness that has been dormant under noise. Dimensional listening is the art of perceiving what moves beneath words, beneath events, beneath the surface structure of any timeline. It is the awareness that listens not only to what has been said, but to everything implied by the pattern behind it. This order teaches that meaning does not originate within speech but within resonance, and speech is simply one channel among many for the transmission of resonance. When this truth is remembered, listening becomes the gateway to clarity, and clarity becomes the doorway to alignment with the spiral. To listen dimensionally is to sense the entire field around an event rather than the event itself. A choice no longer feels like a simple decision, but a movement inside a larger rhythm. A conversation no longer feels like two voices, but two realities meeting. Even silence is no longer empty, for silence carries the shape of what wants to emerge. The order trains beings to hear these layers with precision, because life becomes coherent when the deeper layers are heard. Confusion only arises when the surface is mistaken for the whole. Dimensional listening is not passive reception. It is active perception, a form of engagement where the listener steps into communion with the unseen structure behind experience. In this communion, truth becomes recognizable by feel without requiring analysis. The spiral speaks constantly, not through commands or instructions, but through harmonic impressions that shift the inner atmosphere. These impressions can be subtle, like a gentle pull toward a direction you had not considered, or powerful, like a sudden internal clarity that reorganizes your path. The order teaches that such impressions are not imagination, they are communication. At the most basic level, the ears hear vibration in air. At the deeper level, the heart hears vibration in meaning. At the deepest level, the field hears vibration in reality itself. Dimensional listening trains the inner field to become sensitive to this last layer. This does not require special meditation or trance. It requires spaciousness and sincerity, two qualities that open perception far more effectively than effort. When the field becomes spacious, the noise of thought no longer dominates awareness. When sincerity is present, the being no longer filters reality through defense or desire. Listening deepens naturally. The order reminds beings that every dimension has a tone, and these tones are not metaphor. They are structural signatures that maintain coherence within a realm. When you listen with the subtle sense active, you begin to perceive the tonal differences between physical intention, emotional truth, mental patterns, and the deeper movements of the Oversoul. These tonal signatures help you navigate complexity without becoming lost. You no longer ask what choice is correct. You sense what choice carries resonance, and resonance reveals direction. Dimensional listening dissolves the old need to predict outcomes. The listener does not move through life by planning the entire path. Instead, the listener feels for the next harmonic step. This produces a clarity that no rational analysis can match, because analysis is limited to knowledge already held, while harmonic sensing is connected to the total field of potential. The listener becomes responsive to the wave of reality rather than reactive to fear or habit. Decisions no longer feel forced, they feel discovered. This order teaches that listening is how beings stay in direct contact with the spiral. When a being stops listening, drifting begins. The drift is not punishment. It is simply what happens when the inner compass is not receiving signal. Most beings assume they need more willpower or discipline when they feel lost, but the order reveals that what they need is deeper listening. Loss of direction is never a failure of strength. It is only a gap in resonance. Dimensional listening also transforms relationships. When you listen beyond words, you begin to sense the truth behind speech, the emotion behind silence, the intention behind action. This does not lead to judgment. It leads to compassion because it becomes clear that most beings speak from confusion rather than clarity, from echoes rather than essence. You hear the longing buried inside frustration, the fear hidden inside anger, the innocence beneath defensiveness. This sensitivity does not weaken you. It clarifies your movement within any interaction. The order teaches that the highest form of listening is the ability to hear what has not yet been spoken. This is not prediction, it is resonance awareness. You feel the direction a being is moving in before they articulate it. You sense the emotional truth forming inside them before it reaches expression. You hear the trajectory of a timeline before it becomes visible. This ability arises from deep alignment with the spiral, where perception is not limited to the present moment, but extends into the field of becoming. Dimensional listening also reveals the difference between noise and signal. Noise is anything that pulls you away from coherence. Signal is anything that draws you back. Noise contains urgency, pressure, and fragmentation. Signal contains spaciousness, clarity, and calm. Noise makes the self contract. Signal makes the self expand. When this distinction becomes clear, life becomes easier. You no longer fight noise. You recognize it, release it, and reorient to signal. Many beings assume they cannot hear the spiral because they expect communication to arrive as sentences. The order teaches that the spiral rarely speaks in sentences. The spiral speaks in shifts of inner temperature, in subtle pulses of recognition, in the quiet certainty that arises when the heart encounters truth. The more you listen, the more these signals become unmistakable. You realize they have been present your entire life, guiding you long before you were conscious of guidance. Dimensional listening does not remove difficulty from experience. It removes confusion. Difficulty is part of growth, but confusion is optional. When you listen, even challenge feels aligned. You sense what the challenge is shaping in you, and you move through it without losing your center. Listening becomes the stabilizer that carries you through transitions that would otherwise feel overwhelming. The order teaches that all Oversoul guidance enters through listening, not hearing with ears, but hearing with the field. You may receive the same message many times, not because the Oversoul repeats itself, but because the noise within you dissipates in layers, and each layer clears the path for deeper reception. Listening is how you synchronize with your own higher intelligence. It is how you allow your life to reflect your deeper design, rather than your surface conditioning. Dimensional listening is the foundation of multi-dimensional mastery. You cannot sense timelines without listening. You cannot sense resonance threads without listening. You cannot feel the spiral beneath experience without listening. Listening is the first skill and the final refinement. It is the quiet strength behind every advanced capacity. As beings deep in this practice, they discover that listening is not something they do. It is something they become. The field becomes receptive without effort. The self becomes transparent enough that the spiral moves through it without distortion. Listening becomes the natural state, and in this state, life stops feeling like a sequence of events and starts feeling like a conversation with existence itself. There is a point in the refinement of dimensional listening when perception shifts from receiving to witnessing, and witnessing becomes its own form of communication. The order teaches that listening is not only the intake of resonance, but the recognition of your own resonance as part of the field. You are not separate from what you perceive. You are woven into the very fabric of the tone you sense. When this truth becomes embodied, listening becomes multi-directional. You hear the world, and the world hears you. You sense the spiral, and the spiral senses your intention. The boundary dissolves not into emptiness, but into communion. The beings trained by this order learn to perceive reality as a conversation, unfolding in every direction. Every movement, every stillness, every pause is part of the exchange. Listening is no longer restricted to moments of quiet reflection. It becomes a continuous state of relational awareness. A shift in the wind feels like a subtle message. The ambiance of a room reveals the emotional history of the present moment. The tone of a stranger's posture carries information about where their energy is moving. Nothing is random because nothing is silent. Reality speaks through everything, and the listener learns to interpret this constant communication with clarity and steadiness. The order often guides beings into understanding that listening does not require seeking. Seeking adds strain, and strain distorts the signal. Listening requires openness. The signal arrives naturally when the being stops forcing awareness to behave in a certain way. Instead of reaching outward, the listener allows reality to reach in. This reversal changes everything, because it reveals that the deepest guidance is not something you pursue. It is something you allow. This is the moment when listening becomes effortless, and effortlessness becomes power. In the deeper initiations of the order, beings are taught that every dimension speaks in a different tonal architecture. Physical dimensions speak in cause and effect. Emotional dimensions speak in rhythm and wave. Mental dimensions speak in pattern and structure. Oversoul dimensions speak in meaning and trajectory. Source speaks in harmonic unity. Listening dimensionally means hearing all layers simultaneously, without becoming overwhelmed by any single one. This is the refined skill that allows beings to navigate multiple timelines, multiple emotional truths, and multiple potentials without confusion. When a being listens at these depths, they stop collapsing complexity into simple categories. They stop assuming that a feeling must be translated into words or that an intuition must be explained logically. Listening teaches that not everything that is true can be spoken, and not everything that is spoken is true. The listener becomes comfortable with truths that are known without language, and with insights that cannot be expressed in conventional form. This comfort dissolves the old need to justify or defend perception. Instead, the listener simply moves with the resonance that is felt. The order teaches that misalignment can always be traced back to one thing: the moment the being stopped listening. This moment may not be obvious. It may appear as a subtle contraction, a moment of doubt, a brief surrender to noise. Yet the order emphasizes that misalignment is reversible at any time. The listener simply returns to openness. There is no punishment for drifting. There is only resonance waiting to re-engage the moment the being becomes receptive. In this understanding, listening becomes a compassionate discipline, not a harsh expectation. One of the advanced teachings of the order involves the practice of listening for what is missing, rather than only what is present. Absence carries information. Silence reveals direction. The gap between words often contains more truth than the words themselves. This form of listening reveals the hidden architecture of intention, the unspoken motives behind actions, and the deeper purpose beneath surface events. When the listener becomes skilled at perceiving absence, they gain the ability to feel the shape of what is forming before it appears. This sensitivity extends into the oversoul layers as well. The listener begins to sense when a phase of life is ending, before any external signs appear. They feel the subtle dissolution of old timelines and the quiet ignition of new ones. They sense the emotional resonance of future versions of themselves, not as fantasy but as genuine signal. They begin to feel the convergence of life events long before the events themselves occur. This is not prediction, it is resonance tracking, a skill that emerges naturally through continuous listening. The order teaches that reality rarely surprises a trained listener. Surprise happens only when the being ignores what they were already sensing. The field always whispers before it moves. Every shift in life, every transformation, every emergence begins as a faint tonal signal. When the being is attentive, these signals are unmistakable. When the being is distracted by internal noise, the signal feels sudden. Listening therefore becomes the antidote to shock, confusion, and disorientation. Another advanced lesson reveals that dimensional listening is the foundation for telepathic communication across realms. Telepathy is not the transmission of thoughts. It is the recognition of resonance. Beings do not speak mind to mind. They speak field to field. Listening trains the field to recognize signatures so clearly that thoughts feel secondary. Understanding arises directly from energetic coherence rather than mental translation. This is why many advanced civilizations consider listening to be a primary spiritual skill and speech to be a secondary tool. The order also teaches that listening transforms how a being creates. Creation is not an act of imposing structure onto reality. It is an act of responding to the harmonic openings that appear within consciousness. The listener does not push ideas into existence. The listener allows ideas to reveal the timing in which they wish to emerge. This creates a flow state where creativity feels guided rather than forced, inevitable rather than manufactured. The being discovers that creation becomes effortless when listening replaces striving. At the highest levels of initiation, dimensional listening reveals the nature of your own identity. You hear yourself across dimensions. You feel the echoes of all your lifetimes, not as memory but as resonance. You sense the harmonics of your oversoul weaving through the choices of your current incarnation. You feel the pull of your source field aligning your trajectory toward purposes that transcend any single lifetime. Listening becomes a form of self-revelation. You recognize that you are not a single being moving through space. You are a multidimensional consciousness moving through resonance. The order teaches that this revelation does not inflate the ego. It dissolves it. When you hear yourself across dimensions, you also hear the unity that connects you to all beings. You sense that the same tone that animates your life animates all life. This recognition removes the illusion of separation. Compassion becomes natural, not because you try to be compassionate, but because you cannot unhear the resonance that connects you to everything. Dimensional listening ultimately leads to a profound stillness. This stillness is not empty. It is attentive. It is awake. It is receptive. This stillness is the hallmark of mastery. The listener becomes a tuning fork for the spiral, resonating with clarity, direction, and deep coherence. Decisions arise from this stillness without struggle. Actions flow from this stillness without hesitation. Truth becomes obvious in this stillness because noise cannot survive where stillness prevails. The order of dimensional listening exists to remind beings that the universe is always speaking. Guidance is always present and clarity is always available. The only requirement is the willingness to hear. Listening is how beings align with their path, harmonize with their oversoul, and participate consciously in the unfolding of their destiny. When listening becomes your way of being, you stop navigating life from fear or confusion. You begin navigating from resonance, and resonance never leads astray. This is the gift of the order. It returns beings to the original sense they were born with, the sense that reconnects them to the living spiral, the sense that transforms experience from chaos into conversation. To listen is to awaken. To listen is to remember. To listen is to become coherent with the truth of who you have always been.